Okay, so see on the screen there these little bars every time I speak, or if you speak or make noise. Now you notice that the bars, the different colors. The different colors are for the intensity. So the reds are more intense sounds, the blues are less intense sounds. The other thing is that low notes are down there, high notes are up there. Okay, so the different point on up and down is different parts of the spectrum. So high notes are very high parts. So every time I speak with many frequencies. The main ones are the ones that are red, but there's other higher frequencies included to give me the tone of my voice. You can see the flute playing, and you can see that the notes climbed up and down, and you can see now we'll see in this lecture that what you're seeing here is like the ear works. So different parts of the ear are like a strip along here. So in your hearing system, there's a strip of neurons, and each one of them senses different frequencies. So if there's a neuron up here firing, it tells the brain that there's high notes. If there's a neuron down here firing, it tells the brain that there's a low note playing. So you don't hear the pitch. Okay. So you don't hear the pitch itself. It is which neuron is firing that gives you the sensation of the pitch. So something firing here will give you that particular sensation. Something firing up here will give you a different sensation of a different frequency. The loudness is how much each of these neurons, like say, the ones over here are firing a lot. The ones up here are firing just a little bit. And they tell the brain how loud the sound is at that frequency. So, with that introduction, we can go on to the lecture itself. Here we go. Okay. Now, the importance of hearing. Most people, I think, would think that vision is the most important sense that you have. And it may be true. But think of all the things that you would miss if you didn't have hearing. Imagine sitting down at a table with your friends or family and not being able to partake in the conversation. Imagine just walking to work and not hearing an approaching car or approaching truck. If you're a child and you can't hear, they often mistake the fact that you're not being able to hear with the fact that maybe you're mentally impaired, cognitively impaired. And of course, if your ears start ringing, it can drive you crazy. very, especially occurs at old age. My wife suffers from tinnitus. So how does hearing work? Well, it begins with the ear. Sounds have to be produced by something, me speaking. Here's a speaker vibrating. And it pushes the air. And you notice two things. First of all, you heard nothing when the speaker started vibrating, and it took some time for these waves. They were, in part, the air got compressed, and then the air got rarefied, less dense. And these waves of compressed air and rarefied air moved into the ear, and then here you have your eardrum. It moved that eardrum and started a whole process that allows you to hear. You can hear things with soft sounds or loud sounds. And that again is produced by this speaker pushing things a bigger distance. So you see the soft sound producing a big compression, a little compression, and the loud sound, a large compression. And in turn, this eardrum gets pushed a lot or a little. You can generate things of high frequency or low frequency. When they're at high frequency, there's a lot of waves of moving down here in rapid succession, pushing this rapidly back and forth. Now, the range of hearing goes from about 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Now, hertz means cycles per second. So this air gets pushed, compressed and rarefied so many times per second. Okay, so 20 would be very slowly. 20,000 would be very, very fast. As you age, this range becomes smaller and smaller, and especially this high frequency range. So one of the things that students in exams discovered was their iPhones could produce sounds of high pitch that the profs couldn't hear. So, but they could because they were young still. And as a consequence, could communicate with each other without the knowledge of the prof. You're most sensitive to these frequencies, 2,000 to 4,000, because that's the frequency that most people speak at. Now, here are the parts, physical structures involved in the ear. You have out here is your canal. And one thing interesting about the canal is that there's skin along the edge of the canal, and wax is formed in here to keep this pliable and to trap any particles that come in. The interesting thing about this skin is that new skin is developed over here, and it travels out of your ear canal. So if anything gets lodged in there with time, including wax, it'll normally move out. And so you won't have a buildup of wax unless something goes wrong. When something goes wrong, then of course wax gets built up in here and reduces your ability here to a doctor or a nurse pours hot water into your ear and melts the wax and flushes it out. This is air. Here is air as well. So Between this eardrum and this little drum here, there's a bone structure that transmits the vibrations from here to here. And this is air, as I mentioned. Beyond here is fluid. And in this fluid, there's a structure called your cochlea. And it's the cochlea because in Greek, that's the shape of a snail. So inside this snail-like structure, there's a ribbon of neurons. And those are the things that you, similar to the stripes that you saw in the demonstration at the beginning of the lecture. Those, so over here is where you sense some frequencies, and over here you sense other frequencies. And all along here are different cells that sense those different frequencies. So that you saw sound, and what happened here is that it pushes these ossicles and pushes on this smaller drum. And this is a sort of a diagram. Imagine this is the snail, that like structure that we saw before. So we've just drawn it out here, and along here are all the neurons that I talked about. Now the question is, why do we need this middle part here? Well, if we didn't have this middle part here, air contains very light molecules, whereas water contains much denser molecules. And if this air molecule, like a ping pong ball, struck this, which would be like a billiard ball, it would just bounce off. So all the energy from the air wouldn't be transmitted to the neurons located here. But with these bones, you have a lever system. So this light little ping pong ball can move this big billiard ball. It's like having a jack. With a jack, you can lift the whole car with what little strength you have. So it's the same principle. That plus the fact that there's a big drum here and a little drum here. So the lever system of these bones plus this amplification by different areas of drums allows you to move the molecules into this structure here. The other thing you have is a little muscle attached to the bone. And that muscle you can contract. And you can contract it pre-programmed wise before you speak. Your own voice can damage the fine little structures that you have inside your neurons here. So every time you speak, this muscle contracts just before you produce the sound. It also contracts after you enter something loud. So let's say you walk into a room with a big rock concert going on. These muscles will contract and protect the cells inside your ear. There are times, of course, they can't protect it. That is, if a sudden gunshot goes off, that gunshot will travel right in and only afterwards will this reflex contract these muscles to protect it. So things like gunshots can damage the structures inside you. We'll talk about that more later. Now, what happens when everything works? Well, if everything works, the pressure that these bones exert push on this basilar membrane. But we've got to have a release valve to let out the pressure. And you have another little round window here that lets the pressure of this fluid come out. If you didn't have this round window, it would be like pressing on water inside or liquid inside a can of pop. It would be incompressible with a finger. So this releases the fluid that's in here. Now, if that works, it moves the cells that get bent. So you can see here, this thing is being bent. And that bend takes the cells that are attached to that membrane, the basilar membrane. And these cells are remarkable because these cells have little hairs on them. And you have the longer ones and the shorter ones. And that shakes them back and forth. Well, what does that do? Well, surprisingly, from the top of each hair to the top of the next hair, you have a thinner little cord of proteins that pull on a valve that allows potassium to flow into the cell. That potassium has a positive charge, and that positive charge causes that cell to release a transmitter from this neuron to the next neuron. Okay? So imagine that you've got hairs, and on each hair you have tiny little hairs that open and close these valves. That's a very delicate system that you have to learn to protect throughout your lifetime because they don't grow back. Now, the other thing that happens is as this pushes on the basilar membrane, that indents it and causes a wave to travel down the whole of the basilar membrane. Imagine if I had a whip and I flicked it, I would cause a wave to travel down the length of the whip. If I had a cord here and somebody else held the other end of the cord and I whipped it, a wave would travel from you to me, from me to you. Now, the odd thing about this wave is that it changes size. So it starts small, then gets bigger, then gets smaller again. Okay? Well, there's a reason for that. This basilar membrane, it doesn't have the same properties all along this length. The basilar membrane is narrow and stiff at this part, and it's wide and floppy at this end. So it's something like the strings on a piano. These when they get plucked, are sensitive, produce high frequency vibrations. So this end here, when this produces a big wave, it becomes sensitive it produces a large wave here for high frequencies. Over here, it produces a large wave for low frequencies, like the strings of a piano. So you can see here, different parts get activated for different frequencies. So you hear that tone, not because some neuron in the brain is shaking at those frequencies, okay? But it's because neurons here, here, and here get activated at different times. Okay? So it's kind of odd to think about it, that it's not how fast a neuron is producing action potentials, but which neuron is producing the action potentials that allows you to hear different tones. And so this is like the labeled line in touch, you know. You sense a certain texture or fragrance, roughness because of those labeled lines. Color is the same way. You sense different colors because different neurons were firing. Okay? So the same thing here. Now, the loudness changed because this neuron here was vibrated less for the soft sounds and more for the loud sounds. Okay, so the frequency of each neuron tells you how loud a particular sound is. If a neuron here is shaking a lot, it tells you there's a loud sound here. If this neuron here is shaking a lot, you know those loud, high frequency sounds. Okay, so normally when we listen to music like this, or in most things in life, you have many neurons firing at the same time. And each one fires at different levels and different amounts. So this basilar membrane and the neurons on it are something like a synthesizer that you sometimes play with on a computer, where you have the heights here tell you how loud a particular frequency of sound is. So think of the basilar membrane as a synthesizer. Now, different things can damage your ear. Extremely loud sounds can rupture your eardrum, can break the ossicles, and can break the basilar membrane. Less loud sounds, but still high, can break the hairs on your hair cells. And for that you only need play your iPhone at extremely loud sounds. Clinicians can tell if you played in a rock band for a long time by doing a test of your ability to hear different frequencies. And an indicative test of being in a rock band is your ability to hear low frequencies is gone. And that's because the hairs on the hair cells are in your low frequency range have been damaged. Now, other things can happen is that you can get an infection. And when you get an infection, this middle ear can get filled with fluid. And then that sort of short circuits the ability of the ossicles to amplify the sound waves. And then various molecules can enter the hairs themselves and poison them. And some formulations of antibodies were originally developed that had this malfunctions in that they entered the cells and produced deafness, killed the hair cell. And of course, old age can happen, and that can do all kinds of things. Your parts wear out. Blockage of blood can kill cells. The hairs of the hair cells can go with time. And gradually, your ability to hear gets harder and harder to do so. Okay. Okay, that's good. It disappeared. Now, there's another neat thing about hearing, is that the neat thing about hearing is that you have two ears. Okay, and that because you have two ears, it's like having two eyes. Having two eyes gives you ability to see in stereo, see how far away an object is. Two ears give you ability to tell what direction the sound is coming from. And it does so by doing two different types of comparisons. One is, you notice the sounds were coming from different parts of the room. And that's because your head acts like blocks the sound to one ear. So if the sound is coming from that speaker, your head blocks the sound from the other speaker, and that sound is heard louder. Similarly, if it's the other way, you hear that the sound is coming from this ear louder, and you'd know that that's the direction the sound is coming from. The other way for the brain to know which direction the sound is coming from is by timing. The loudness was mainly used for high-frequency sounds. The timing is used for low-frequency sounds. That it measures the timing between the sound hitting one ear from the sound hitting the other ear. Now, sound travels very fast. The speed of sound is something like 500 miles per hour. So this is able to measure very, very small differences in time. And the brain is remarkable because the difference in time is something like 10/1,000,000th of a second. And it's able to do so. Now, the other thing you have is your earlobes. One of their main functions is to collect the sound. So it sort of channels all the sound into your canal. But the other thing you have is little funny structures on your ear, okay? And that causes sounds to bounce off these little structures and produce sort of echoes. And those echoes tell the brain a lot of information. They can tell whether the sound is coming from above you or below you. So you have that ability as well. And then you can turn your head to where the sound is equal to the 2 ears, and you can then determine more accurately where the sound is coming from. The other thing is that vision has a very important influence on the sound. And we'll see more of that in a few minutes. Now, okay, where does the sound information go from here, the sensors in your ear, to your brain? Well, it travels down these neurons here and enters the superior olivary nucleus. And this picture here, there's another one over here that I haven't drawn. It's a mirror image, okay? There's not just one superior olivary nucleus. There's one on both sides that you have everywhere in the brain, a symmetry between the two sides. Now, this superior olivary nucleus does two things. There's a lateral part that measures the intensity differences between two ears. So this structure here is comparing what's happening from this side and this side. One part of the superior olivary nucleus measures the intensity differences. The other part, the medial part, examines the timing differences. From there, the sound information travels up the spinal cord to this place called the inferior colliculus. The inferior colliculus is very near the superior colliculus. They're adjacent little structures. The inferior colliculus has a map of where the sound is coming from. And it tells the superior colliculus where the sound is coming from. And so if I hear a loud sound from the opposite side of the room, my head turns to that sound, or my eyes turn to that sound to find out what that sound is coming from. Then from there you go through the thalamus, as in all senses, and you go up to the primary auditory cortex. And the primary auditory cortex is the first place where you have this conscious perception of sound. If it didn't reach here, you would be unconscious of the sound that's being played. Now, a quiz. Okay, we do our clapping, hitting the table as hard as we can. So you see this. This is one action potential, then two, then three, then four, then five. And they're about a millisecond apart. So this is what one neuron is doing on your right basilar membrane. And the question is, what's going on here? First choice, again, is 5 similar sounds are played, one every millisecond. Anyone in favor of that? Nope. 5 sounds are played at increasing frequency. known for that. 5 sounds are played of increasing intensity. Okay, you got it right if you hit the table. Yes, if this is a single neuron, then it must be coding only one frequency, not 5 different frequencies. And the thing that will cause it to fire more is a louder sound. So this is a soft sound. This is a loud sound. The other possibility is one sound of this many hertz is played. Probably most of you say no. Okay. What about this? 5 sounds are played shifting from the left to the right. No? You don't think so? Well, this is the right basilar membrane. Okay. If a sound shifts from the left to the right, then the right basilar membrane is going to be firing more when the sound is on the right than on the left. Okay. So as you shift from left to right, this will increase in fire rate. Okay. So there's 2 answers to that question. This one and this one. Okay. When we get to the cortex, you have your primary auditory cortex. And on it, you have columns. And each of the columns, the cells within each column, are sensitive to one particular frequency. Okay. And the primary auditory cortex is laid out like your basilar membrane, with low frequencies located at this end, the front end, or the anterior end, and high frequencies, low frequencies at this end, high frequencies at the back end. Okay. So you have a tonotopic representation. Now, if any sound is heard, it has to go through A1. So this is sensitive to all sounds. Around A1, a little bigger over here, is sounds that could be the building blocks of words. Okay? They're not necessarily words, but the building blocks of words. So these are called phonemes. Ba, ga, r, l. They're building blocks. And we'll talk more about these building blocks later. Now, this A1 is also in some textbooks called the core area, and A2 called the belt. And within both of these structures, you've got many maps of frequencies, many maps of where frequencies starts at one end and then starts repeating itself at the other end. And so this is like V1, V2, V3, maps that flip back and forth in a mirror-like arrangement. Now, when we get further back, we get to an area called Wernicke's area. And that's important because that's where you have word comprehension. So here you got parts of words, and here you have the whole part of a word being understood. Now, newborns have the ability to um, um, hear every types of phoneme. Okay? And it doesn't matter where you're born, all over the world, every newborn human hears the same sets of phonemes. Okay? So the things like ba, ga. Now, the set of phonemes you have now is a subset of those, because each one of you grew up in a certain environment that you only heard a subset of those phonemes. And so you have a filter, and that filter becomes sort of ossified at about 6 months of age. And it begins to develop this ability to distinguish between the different types of phonemes before birth. So a baby inside a womb is listening to sounds. And by listening to sounds, it's starting to develop this ability to detect this sound, and it's different from this sound. So what this does is, if you say pa and ba, imagine saying it, pa, ba. There's a slight difference in where your lips are, okay? And as each person says these pa or ba, the pas are slightly different, and the bas are slightly different. And so these filters allow a baby or any human to be able to distinguish what are bas and what are pas, even though there's slight variations in each one. They act like magnets.
Ba, 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 pow, 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 pow.
So what happened here was this baby had a pacifier, and that pacifier was wired to something that monitored it, and sounds were played. And when the baby heard ba, it woke up and started sucking the pacifier. Then it got bored and went back to sleep again. Then that ba changed to a pa. That pa then woke the baby up and started sucking its pacifier again. And then got bored and went back to sleep again. And so, with that system of pacifier that's connected to a recorder of some kind, you can go around the whole world and see what phonemes each baby hears. And so this lady called Patricia Cruz, she did that. She and her students went around the whole world with a recording of all the phonemes that they could gather from all the phonemes all over the world, and played them to each baby, and found that babies in one area of the world were the same as the babies in another area of the world. And they were the same up to about the age of 6 months. And then they started being different. Okay? The babies then became selective only to the phonemes that are around in their environment and unable to distinguish between forms that were outside of their environment. So in English, we have the ability to distinguish between R's and L's. And again, that try R, you put your tongue back to your tongue. L, you put your tongue forward in your mouth, okay? One is back, one is forward. Slight difference. And you can hear that every time. I can move my tongue back and forth and say, go from L to R, and in between, no, what's that? It's hard to tell whether it's an L or an R. So that ability to hear depends on your ability to develop these magnets. And in English, you can, if you're raised in an English environment. But if you're raised, let's say, in a Japanese environment, where they don't have R, L sounds, I'm told, you don't develop these filters, and as a consequence, you have an inability to distinguish between these two sounds. Similarly, if you're raised in an English environment, there are many phonemes in the Japanese environment that you can't hear. And that's partly why, as you grow up in your environment, you tend to speak then with an accent in a different environment, because you can't hear those differences. Okay? So it's hard to relearn to speak in a different language to get those, because you can't hear those different phonemes. Now, what happens, what other parts of the brain are involved in language? Well, let's look at the places that would be activated if you were to try to read out loud. Okay? And this, what I'll describe here, it's something called the Wernicke-Geschwind model. And it's simplistic, but it's a useful first step in trying to understand how this process will work. So the first thing that happens, of course, is as you read, vision gets activated. And this early area of the vision helps you detect the lines and the curves that are the letters. From there, you go to something called the visual word form area. And that puts together the left and right sides of a word. When you look at a word, one part of the word goes to your left side of the brain, and the other part of the word goes to the other side of the brain. Some part of the brain has to put these two things together. And in most humans, it is this visual form area, and it's located on the left side. And it's located where you would normally find the fusiform face area, but on the left. So the fusiform face area is larger on the right, and this visual form area seems to be taking over the back end of this fusiform area. And like the fusiform face area, it allowed you to quickly recognize the face. You saw a face, you could quickly recognize who that face is, whether it's someone familiar to you or a stranger. And that developed early in our, as humans developed. In fact, animals are able to distinguish between faces, have a fusiform face area. It's important to distinguish between someone in your environment versus someone, another tribe of let's say, monkeys or even elephants. Now, if you have the problem with this, of course, is that we haven't we have a all grow up with a fusiform face area, but when we're born, we don't have a visual form, word form area. We have to develop it. We have to develop it through rigorous practice. Okay? We have to learn from kindergarten to grade school to be able to read. And if you have damaged the visual form area, fusiform area, you have prosopagnosia, you can't recognize faces. If you have some sort of malfunction of your visual form, word form area, you have dyslexia, and that's a reading disability. So early damage here, the back end of the fusiform area will cause a reading disability. Now from there, you go to the PTO, which, and especially the underside of the temporal cortex. And that's where you combine your ability to see, hear, or touch, or even taste objects to be able to recognize them. So for example, an apple you can recognize by the letters apple. They can also be, if you were to understand Braille, you can detect it by touch. You can feel an apple and know it's an apple. You can taste an apple and know it's an apple. So from all these senses, they could combine here for the object apple. Then from there you go to the Wernicke's area, where verbal understanding occurs. So you convert your knowledge of apple to the sound of apple. Okay, so then you can. Then this area here is activated when you read, see the word apple, get activation here. When you hear the word apple, or even when you touch things and feel the word apple through Braille. Now, you remember that biological motion activates the superior temporal sulcus. And that area is important, a biological motion area. It's important for things like lip reading. And that in turn activates this area here. So one of the things I want to show you, if I can find it.
Concentrate first on the right of the screen. Now to the left of the screen. The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
At the picture there. What we see has a big effect on what we hear. And a lot of people use their lip reading to be able to understand what people are saying. Like, let's say you're in a crowded environment with lots of sounds coming out. You often are able to understand what the person next to you is saying by looking at the lips moving, rather than necessarily hearing what a person is saying. From there, you go to a structure called Broca's area, which is responsible for verbal expression, okay? Being able to produce the words. This is located here in the frontal lobe, and in the frontal lobe you have working memory. Working memory is important because you have to put the words of your sentence in the right order in order for them to be understood meaningfully. So you need to structure the sentence before you speak it. And then from there it goes to the motor area, in this case the face. You have all your muscles organized along this strip here, similar to the strip behind the central sulcus. And each of these areas activates different parts of the body. This particular part here activates your lips and your throat and your lungs as well. So what happens when a person has a lesion in Wernicke's area? Well, a person has trouble understanding language, especially all language. The patient can say words because this area is damaged, but often they're nonsense words. If, on the other hand, you have a damage of Broca's area, the patient can't say the right word or the right grammar. Remember, you have to put the words in the sentence in the right order. Okay? If you have damage here, you say a sentence with the words in the wrong order or with incorrect grammar. But because this area is still okay, you can hear properly and understand what's being said, just not be able to produce it. And so another thing is that if you are deaf, you can be taught something called American Sign Language. And so you use hand gestures for speaking. And the interesting thing is that if you have damage to Broca's area, you're unable to produce the expressive hand gestures, the gestures themselves. If you have damage to Wernicke's area, you have deficits in understanding what those hand gestures mean. So these areas are not simply for the sounds, but also for things like the sign language that's associated with language. There's also a what and where stream in this system. Okay, the auditory what stream flows forward from these primary areas along the anterior temporal lobe and then the prefrontal cortex. This area is used. This pathway is used to identify the sound object. Okay, is it a bird? Is it a person? Is it a person that I know? Or things like violins or what. The other stream, the where stream, flows this way, and it is good at locating the source of the sound, whether it's left, right, up, above, and below you, behind. It's also able to look at the temporal properties of the sound. And the temporal properties of the sound, of course, tell you what the sound sounds like and what it represents. So it's important for understanding speech. And that's it.